Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I'm finally getting around to checking out Nvidia's new GeForce RTX GPUs for laptops, and that's starting with the RTX 2070. Hopefully at some point I'll get around to doing, a full performance breakdown of each of the new RTX laptop offerings. But I have to start somewhere, and thanks to Gigabyte, we're kicking things off with the middle of the pack 2070 in its Max-Q variant. Obviously at this point, the desktop version of the RTX 2070 has been on the market for a little while, and we know exactly how it performs. However, the laptop variant is interesting because it's not an identical copy of the desktop card. And this is where Nvidia's GeForce 20 series begins to be a bit confusing for buyers of laptops used to the Pascal lineup that's been around for a few years now. So let's go back to Pascal and check out how the lineup looked. The three main offerings were the GTX 1060, the GTX 1070, and the GTX 1080. Excluding the Max-Q variants for a moment, the main regular laptop versions were very similar to their desktop counterparts. The GTX 1060, for example, had the same CUDA to core count, and while the base clock was a little lower, the rated boost clock was only 38 MHz lower than the desktop card. For the most part, in a good laptop design, the laptop GTX 1060 performed like a desktop GTX 1060. Then there was the GTX 1080, again same CUDA core count and even the same boost clock. The GTX 1070 was a little different in that the laptop variant had a slight increase to CUDA cores along with a slight decrease in clocks, but the end result was that a laptop GTX 1060 again performed around the mark of a desktop GTX 1070, and back then times were simple. Then Nvidia introduced Max-Q variants, which were underclocked versions of the GPU designed to slot into thin and light systems that perhaps didn't have the cooling capabilities of the usual chunky gaming laptops. A lot of people hated on Max-Q, but the reality is it did allow for more performance in a given design. Not the full performance of the labeled GPU, but better than the tier below, and considering most laptops that had Max-Q GPUs were marketed as such, there wasn't a whole lot of confusion there. But come the GeForce 20 series, Nvidia has taken things a step further. We still have Max-Q laptops, but it's the regular non-Max-Q GPUs that have also received pretty significant clock speed cuts compared to the desktop variants. I won't go through every variant here, but focusing in on the RTX 2070, we can see where the cuts have occurred. The GPU still has the same CUDA core count, 2,304 cores, which I guess is why Nvidia can still call this an RTX 2070. It's the same physical GPU, but clock speeds are significantly lower. The absolute maximum rated boost clock you'll see for this laptop variant is 1440 MHz with a 1215 MHz base, and that's the fully fledged version. Compare that to the desktop card, which has a 1410 MHz base clock, along with the 1620 MHz boost, which goes up to 1710 MHz for the Founders Edition card. So with a fully fledged non-Max-Q RTX 2070 for laptops, the rated boost clock is only 30 MHz higher than the desktop card's base clock. This has introduced a situation where, once again, Nvidia's laptop versions are no longer a direct copy of the desktop GPU. Within a few percent, Pascal laptops were basically copies of the desktop card, but with Turing, we're looking at clock speed deficits of 200 MHz or more for the regular RTX 2070. And it gets worse with the Max-Q model, which sits at an 885 MHz base clock and an 1185 MHz boost clock. Max-Q clocks, yeah, they have always been lower than the non-Max-Q models, but even the non-Max-Q models are now downclocked compared to the desktop cards. So the gulf between a Max-Q laptop and a desktop with supposedly the same GPU has widened significantly compared to the last few years. Now, there is a reason to all of this, and it relates to the TDP. Not a lot of people care about this metric for desktop cards, but for laptops it is a crucial figure. As the laptop OEM, they have to design a cooler that can handle the TDP of the GPU, and they have pretty tight space constraints to work with. So with Pascal, we had the GTX 1070 at 150 watts on the desktop and 115 watts for laptops in the fully fledged version. But with the RTX 2070, that is now a 175 watt part on the desktop, but it's still just 115 watts for laptops. The only way to hit that TDP with the same GPU, a GPU that consumes more power when unleashed, is to put it on a leash and lower the clocks. And this does pretty much relate to Nvidia's shifting up of product tiers that we've seen people talk about on the desktop side. The GTX 1060 used to be 120 watts, but the RTX 2060, it's now 160 watts, which occupies where the GTX 1070 used to sit. The RTX 2070 is 175 watts, which is more like a GTX 1080, and then the RTX 2080 comes in at 215 watts, and that's a place where laptops never used to go. And with this predicament, Nvidia could have gone in one of two directions. They could have made RTX laptop GPUs equivalent to RTX desktop GPUs, which would have meant the RTX 2070 replaces the GTX 1080 in designs capable of handling that TDP. The RTX 2060 would then replace the GTX 1070, and the RTX 2080, well, that couldn't really be used. But Nvidia didn't want to do that. Instead, they really chose option 2. And that was to downclock the GPUs so that an RTX 2070 can replace a GTX 1070 and so on, creating, I guess, a simple swap in generations. It makes the laptop versions pretty different to the desktop versions, but maybe Nvidia thought no one would notice. I've probably spent way too much time talking about all of this, but my final point on the matter is that with Nvidia choosing the downclocking route, I feel like using the name RTX 2070 for the laptop RTX 2070 isn't really accurate because it's not the same as the desktop card. And this seems to have confused a few people. We've seen some comments in our Discord chat about people looking to buy RTX laptops thinking that the GPU they're getting is going to be delivering the same performance as the desktop card. Sure, it's the same physical GPU, but it won't deliver the same performance. So I feel with this GPU lineup, it really should have an M on the end of the names of each of the GPUs. So this should be the RTX 2070M. It's not quite the same situation as the GeForce 900 series, where the laptop M variants actually also had different CUDA core counts as well. So something like the GTX 980M had fewer CUDA cores than the GTX 970 on desktops. But I feel the clock speed differences with these Turing GPUs is different enough to warrant a new name. Anyway, you're probably sick of me talking about clock speeds, TDPs, and names, and just want to see the performance numbers. I'll get to that in a moment after a few other important notes. So, like with the desktop card, the RTX 2070 for laptops uses 8GB of GDDR6 at up to 14 gigabits per second, according to Nvidia specs. That means 14 gigabits per second for the fully fledged version and 12 gigabits per second for Max-Q. Same 256-bit bus. We also still have RTX functionality, so the Tensor and RT cores are still there, but due to the GPU being downclocked, performance isn't quite the same. Nvidia cites up to 38 tera RTX ops and 5 gigarows per second for the laptop RTX 2070, compared to 42 RTX ops and 6 gigarows for the reference RTX 2070 desktop card. Today's review is focused on the Max-Q variant of the RTX 2070 simply because, well, that's what I have on hand right now, and what tends to be, I guess, the most popular in the thin and light laptop category. I hope to revisit this look at the RTX 2070 when I have the fully fledged version on hand, but as you might know, it's a slow process to get these laptops in for review. A lot of RTX laptops that I'm looking at haven't been released yet, so as they trickle in, we'll have to do a full performance breakdown for each of them. In case you're wondering, as Max-Q laptops ship with an unchangeable power limit, they cannot be overclocked to the full level of an RTX 2070. You can do some basic core and memory clock overclocking, but the power limit is the main limitation here. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't just magic this laptop into a non-Max-Q model, and neither can buyers. The good news is getting the RTX 2070 Max-Q on hand provides an excellent apples-to-apples comparison opportunity, which with laptops in their various configurations isn't always possible. This opportunity is thanks to Gigabyte with their Aero 15 line. The new model I'm testing today is the Aero 15 X9, which packs the RTX 2070 Max-Q. However, I also have the last gen Aero 15 X on hand with the GTX 1070 Max-Q inside. Because both laptops use the same design, as well as largely the same hardware and cooler, this makes comparing the RTX 2070 to the GTX 1070 pretty easy. The Gigabyte Aero 15 X9 I used also packs Intel's 6-core Core i7-8750H, which is the go-to choice for gaming laptops, which you'll also see used for most of the other laptops in our comparison. My review unit was kitted out with 32 gigabytes of dual-channel DDR4 as well, and this configuration was identical in the Aero 15X with the GTX 1070. The testing here has focused on 1080p gaming. I was planning to do some high-resolution testing, but that has been cut for time constraints, unfortunately. Hopefully I'll cover that in future content. It's also key to note that the Aero 15X9 was tested with the fan mode set to gaming. This does deliver noticeably better performance than the quieter balance mode, and I used this exact same gaming fan mode with the last gen Aero 15X as well, so both laptops were as loud as each other, which again cuts out a further variable when comparing the RTX 2070 to the GTX 1070. In terms of clock speeds, this is where I guess the data starts to come in finally, for you guys who've been sitting through a lot of this discussion so far. While the RTX 2070 Max-Q has a rated boost clock of just 1185 MHz, thanks to Nvidia's GPU boost, actual clock speeds in games were more around the 1250 to 1350 MHz mark. So typically that's at least 100 MHz lower than the fully fledged laptop RTX 2070's boost clock, though of course the full version will also boost a bit higher. This is basically the same behavior as the GTX 1070 Max-Q, which has a rated boost of 1379 MHz but sits more around the 1500 to 1600 MHz mark in games. You should expect these results from any laptop with decent cooling, however those with poor coolers will downclock more aggressively and result in worse performance. Memory clocks, they also don't change, and here the GDDR6 with the Max-Q variant, that's 8GB in this case, is stuck at 12 gigabits per second. So we're going to kick things off with a look at Battlefield 1, probably being superseded by Battlefield 5 these days, but a lot of our existing testing data was for Battlefield 1, so we'll start with that. Here the RTX 2070 Max-Q clocks in at just 7% faster than the GTX 1070 Max-Q, while offering a slight performance gain on the non-Max-Q variant. And this is an okay start, but ideally you'd want to see larger gains here. We know Wolfenstein 2 is one of the most favourable games to Nvidia's new Turing GPU architecture, at least when comparing to Pascal. So here the RTX 2070 Max-Q commands a decent 15% performance lead over the GTX 1070 Max-Q. However, the game is also one that heavily favours the fully fledged GPUs for some reason, so the regular old GTX 1070 is still faster here when looking at average performance. Far Cry 5 is a well-optimized title and one that we like to benchmark with extensively. In this game, you can expect the RTX 2070 to come in with a 9% performance lead over the GTX 1070 when comparing Max-Q versions. That does increase to a 15% lead in 1% lows though, which is nice to see. When comparing the Max-Q 2070 to the full GTX 1070, performance is about equal. In Star Wars Battlefront 2, the RTX 2070 is around 10% faster than the GTX 1070, again comparing Max-Q versions. The newer Turing GPU also holds a small advantage over the full GTX 1070, which seems to be typical for this new Max-Q model. We've only gone through 4 games so far, but in those games the usual result is the Max-Q 2070 delivering the same performance as the non-Max-Q 1070 within the same design constraints, so with the same cooler. Dirt 4 is one of the most favourable games to the RTX 2070 Max-Q. Here the new GPU is 18% faster on average and 11% faster in 1% lows relative to the GTX 1070 Max-Q. It's also a small amount faster than the standard GTX 1070. Not every game you'll play on a laptop though will be GPU limited. At 1080p, a great example of that is Prey, which runs at around 100 FPS on modern laptops, but there's not a lot of difference between most higher end GPUs. The RTX 2070 Max-Q here is only 3% faster than the GTX 1070 Max-Q, and it holds one of the smallest margins over the GTX 1066GB at just 16%. I believe this is more of a memory bottleneck issue than a CPU bottleneck here though. Middle-earth: Shadow of War is another game that is favourable to Turing. Here the RTX 2070 is 16% faster on average compared to the GTX 1070, of course looking at Max-Q variants. It's also 6% faster than the regular GTX 1070, which is one of the larger margins for this GPU. Watch Dogs 2 is in a similar situation to Prey in that the game is quite demanding on the CPU. I spotted a 4% gain to average performance when comparing the RTX 2070 Max-Q to the GTX 1070 Max-Q, but no gain in terms of 1% low performance. Unlike with desktops, where you might pair the RTX 2070 with a much more powerful CPU, the 45-watt CPUs you're stuck with in most laptops can limit the GPU, especially at 1080p. Couple more games I wanted to focus on here. Deus Ex Mankind Divided is an older title, but it's still very GPU limited. Here the RTX 2070 Max-Q is 18% faster than the GTX 1070 Max-Q, and that's a big gain for Nvidia's new Turing architecture. Compared to the average result, this is a bit of an outlier, but nonetheless it's impressive. Finally, we have a game that not many people liked, Mass Effect Andromeda. A decent performance gain here for the RTX 2070 Max-Q, coming in 13% faster than the GTX 1070 Max-Q. It's also a decent 7% faster than the fully fledged GTX 1070. Looking at a full performance summary here across 18 games, we can see that on average, the RTX 2070 Max-Q is 11% faster than the GTX 1070 Max-Q it replaces. You can spot a couple of newer games in here, such as Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which performs remarkably poorly on laptop hardware, along with another largely CPU-limited game in Hitman 2, plus 2 other new titles that deliver good gains in Battlefield 5 and Resident Evil 2. In general though, you can expect performance gains up to around 18% typically, but as low as 3 to 4% in games that aren't as GPU limited. And as we're talking about laptops here, there are more instances where you will run into bottlenecks than a typical gaming desktop build. And this is an important consideration when comparing desktop and laptop GPUs. Comparing the RTX 2070 Max-Q to the regular GTX 1070 is a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, this new Max-Q GPU is now delivering the performance of the last gen fully fledged model, but in smaller, thinner, and lighter systems with weaker cooling solutions. While not always the case, GTX 1070 laptops tended to be on the larger end of the scale. However, with the RTX 2070 Max-Q, we can expect to see that GPU in true thin and light gaming machines. On the other hand, the desktop RTX 2070 is 27% faster than the GTX 1070 on average, so it's pretty obvious how far behind the RTX 2070 Max-Q is for laptops in comparison to the desktop equivalent. I expect the full non-Max-Q model to be faster, but it won't close this gap entirely. The Max-Q to Max-Q margin was 11%, so I'd expect the full versions will have a similar sort of margin, not the 27% margin like with the desktop cards. And of course, Nvidia clocking the laptop version a lot lower will do that. A couple of other comparisons to go. Here we have the RTX 2070 Max-Q compared to the GTX 1060 6GB, a very popular laptop GPU, and a GPU that used to be the maximum for thin and light laptops. The RTX 2070 Max-Q is 35% faster here on average, which shows the progress that has been made in this sort of portable form factor. Of course, RTX 2070 Max-Q laptops are a lot more expensive, but purely from a technical standpoint, it is impressive to see this level of performance gain within the same available space for cooling and power delivery. The RTX 2070 Max-Q is still slower than the GTX 1080 Max-Q though, to the tune of roughly 6%. The GTX 1080 Max-Q is the next step above the GTX 1070, and with the RTX 2070 Max-Q performing around GTX 1070 level, it still makes sense that the GTX 1080 Max-Q is faster. Of course, you'll be wondering how ray tracing performs with the RTX 2070 Max-Q, and the good news is that it works. I actually wasn't expecting to see ray tracing in the laptop versions due to the TDP constraints, but it's there even with the Max-Q variants. However, the RTX 2070 Max-Q is only rated for 4 gigaраys per second, lower than the desktop RTX 2060, so naturally it won't be as good for ray tracing. In our standard Battlefield 5 benchmark run, which does have reflected surfaces that activate the game's DXR reflections, even using just the low ray tracing mode caused a pretty significant performance drop. In our standard Battlefield 5 benchmark run with ultra settings, which does have reflected surfaces that activate the game's DXR reflections, even using just the low ray tracing mode caused a pretty significant performance drop. Without DXR, we were achieving an average of 86 FPS through the run. Turning on DXR to low dropped that to 54 FPS, so we're talking about a sub 60 FPS experience at 1080p here. Turning RTX up to ultra, and yeah, that drops even further to just a 44 FPS average. I don't think many people will want to play a game like Battlefield 5 at below 60 FPS, even at 1080p, when they could be playing at upwards of 80 FPS. So to me, this seems like a bit of a bust, even on the lowest ray tracing settings. So when thinking about how I was going to wrap up this one, there were a lot of thoughts going through my head. While Nvidia's RTX line has been largely disappointing on the desktop side, laptops are an entirely different story with different price points, categories, and considerations to make. So I want to break this down into a few sections. Firstly, the naming scheme to me is still very disappointing, one of the key issues that I have here. The RTX 2070 Max-Q is really nowhere near the performance of a desktop RTX 2070, and with Nvidia also downclocking the regular RTX 2070 for laptops, These GPUs are no longer direct equivalents for their desktop counterparts like they were with Pascal. This is frustrating to me, and I think to avoid confusion, I wish they used a different name, something like RTX 2070M I feel would be appropriate. As for performance, we're getting 10% more out of the RTX 2070 Max-Q compared to the GTX 1070 Max-Q. So for the same product category, which means the same type of laptop with a similar design, size, weight, and cooler, we can expect a modest 10% gain. That's okay, it's fine, it's nothing amazing, but it is faster in the same category. The good news is it seems laptops are also around the same price as well, comparing launch price to launch price. Portable GTX 1070 Max-Q laptops launched in the $2,200 to $2,400 US range, and that's where RTX 2070 Max-Q laptops have launched with similar hardware configurations. However, right now, with discounts because it's an end-of-life product, you can get GTX 1070 Max-Q laptops for about $200 less for any equivalent configuration. So while the launch prices are similar, today you'll have to pay about 10% more and you'll get about 10% more performance in return, at least while old stock for previous gen products is still around. So yeah, like the desktop GPUs, looking at today's pricing, there's not much progress on value here. That said, with the desktop cards, the RTX 2070 came in at $120 higher than the launch price of the GTX 1070, and that doesn't seem to be the case with the laptops. And of course, it's much harder to comment about pricing with these sorts of products because they're set by partners, not Nvidia. They can change a fair bit, it depends on the laptop, etc. But in general, launch prices are similar, while today's GTX 1070 Max-Q laptops have been discounted to what I feel is an appropriate price relative to new RTX 2070 models without being amazing, of course. For some people, RTX GPUs like the RTX 2070 Max-Q will bring additional benefits like ray tracing and DLSS depending on how much stock you place on their importance. Neither are widespread technologies right now, and in our opinion, it's not really something worth considering with your purchase, especially considering how Battlefield 5 performs with ray tracing with this particular GPU. On the surface, this launch is somewhat disappointing. Modest performance gains, no improvement in value, and few additional features of limited use. But at the same time, I feel that perhaps expectations were set a bit too high with the laptop GPUs in particular. While on the desktop, it's all about raw performance and bang for buck. But with laptops, there's the additional factor of performance per watt, or how much you can get out of a given cooler design. As Turing is built on 12 nanometers compared to 16 nanometers for Pascal, there hasn't been a significant uptick in that department, so realistically, we were never going to see a large jump in performance within a given form factor. That said, I do feel like the naming scheme of these particular products has led people to believe that they were going to get, the performance of the desktop class products in the laptops, but as I said, realistically that was probably not going to happen given those constraints of coolers in, similar sized laptops. Laptop upgrade cycle is also very different to on the desktop. Most people buying an RTX laptop aren't just getting a new GPU. They'll likely also be upgrading the CPU, the memory, storage, display, and even the design, which can all add value to a purchase. So while the generation on generation gains are only 10% here for the RTX 2070 Max-Q, a large number of buyers will see actual gains far higher than this with their upgrade, especially when factoring in a bunch of other components getting faster as well. And that just about does it for this review. It's been a long one, but I think I've covered it pretty thoroughly. I'm hoping to, at some point, don't really know when, but I want to get hands-on time with the other 5 RTX GPU variants for laptops and put them through their paces. But at least I've set a lot of groundwork here for what to expect with those other GPUs, and I certainly don't expect to spend as much time on the naming scheme with these laptops in future videos. I think I've done that point to death now, and yeah, I really wish that Nvidia had given these laptop GPUs a different name so that people, didn't confuse them with the desktop parts. But anyway, I've said that point a few times now. As always, you can subscribe for more content. Give it a like if you enjoyed the review. Consider supporting us on Patreon to access our Discord community and other perks, and I'll catch you in the next one.